All right, welcome everyone. I am going to attempt to use Google Slides today when I'm used to PowerPoint, so bear with me if anything happens, but welcome. We're going to begin with Annika leading us through the first few slides here.
Hello, my name is Autumn Anfang. I'm the Vice President for the Division of Business and Finance, and I am very happy to begin this MLK Day Beloved Community Teach-In Workshop session with a reading of the St. Norbert College Land Acknowledgement Statement, as well as share a brief prayer by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to help center ourselves for our time together. In the spirit of the Norbertine value of stabilitas loci, a deep commitment to the local community, we acknowledge this land as the ancestral home of the Menominee Nation, which holds historical, cultural, and sacred significance to the community. We acknowledge the living history and contributions of the indigenous communities that inhabited this land prior to the establishment of St. Norbert College, as well as the sovereign Native American nations who continue to contribute to the flourishing of our communities. And now the prayer. God, we thank you for the inspiration of Jesus. Grant that we will love you with all our hearts, souls, and minds, and love our neighbors as we love ourselves, even our enemy neighbors. And we ask you, God, in these days of emotional tension, when the problems of the world are gigantic in extent and chaotic in detail, to be with us in our going out and our coming in our rising up and in our lying down, in our moments of joy and in our moments of sorrow, until the day when there shall be no sunset and no dawn. Amen. Hello, my name is Autumn Anfang. I'm the Vice President for the Division.
Hello, everyone. My name is Annika Osell, and I am an AmeriCorps member serving at the Cassandra Voss Center at St. Norbert College. I would like to begin our time together today by thanking you for joining us today for the St. Norbert College MLK Day Beloved Community Teach-In. We're grateful that you took the time today to join us as we honor the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I would now like to take a moment to welcome our presenter, Dr. Raquel Lopez.
Thank you, Annika. I just want to make sure you can just see my screen. Can you see your faces as well? Yes, so you can see what this is so, okay. So I wanted to talk a little bit about who I am and kind of position myself in this conversation before sharing a few of my findings and thoughts about ways that we can move forward as a community when it comes to being anti-racist. And so what does that mean? So I wanted just to say part of it is based on my own experiences growing up in a family where we experience the world differently from each other. And I learned a lot from listening to my sisters and from listening to a lot of times the ways that they were treated unfairly. As we've gotten older, our conversations have been more candid and more honest with each other. And it's, in that space is where I first learned to say I'm sorry when it came to, just those kind of difficult conversations, and how I learned to become a better ally for my sisters. And in that way, becoming a better ally for others as well. And so I think about the work that we've been doing at our own campus, in terms of all the different moving pieces, and about how we can make sure that we're moving in a concerted way so that we're both effective, supportive, and that we're able to take initiative when needed. And so I thought, well, what are some ways that we can have that conversation today? And I thought, well, empathy would be useful. And so today's outline, I'm going to move our screen here. Okay. So Annika's going to be in charge of that chat box too. So if you have questions or comments, you can always just post them right in there. But we're going to start off by just, a brief conversation about race. There's been other conversations that have happened nationwide, and today in particular with our own faculty and staff presenting. And then I wanted to share a model that is, relatively new, where we talk about the developmental stages to becoming anti-racist and what that means for our institution. And then one of the ways that I've tried to do this has been, and one of the ways I found to be the most effective has been using novels, and using novels as a way to build strategic empathy, because it is not enough to feel for another if we do nothing about it. And so one of my goals is helping us, as a community, talk about what can we do moving forward, which will lead us into having learning groups where you'll break out into smaller groups to answer a few questions, and then we'll have some closing remarks and conversation. I'd like you to take a moment and read each of these statements. And no one's, you don't have to share, but if you choose to interact, you can type how many of these statements you responded yes to, or you marked as true. Maybe thinking about recent conversations that you've had with others, seeing if have any of these apply or do not apply. So you can also give yourself a negative score if that seems to fit you better. I appreciate you actually responding. This is great to see. So we've got a range of numbers. Now, many of you are marking 2 or 2.5, but that doesn't mean that you're marking them to the same questions, which is, part of what I want you to consider. All right, and I just wanted to kind of get a sense of our room, and so that's very useful. I'm going to continue talking, and I'll come back to where these questions come from and what they tell us in just a moment. When we talk about race, part of my goal today is to move us beyond establishing that racism exists, and to instead talk about what we can do. But in case you're still kind of in that space, or you still have friends where you need to be able to have those conversations with them, there's a bunch of different links. I put them all at the end of the presentation. And one is Business Insider did a great series where they provided 26 different charts. And I find that when you're teaching complex topics, charts are great. And so I provided 2 here that I, after looking through, that I thought were useful for us. If we think about not just any job, but high paying jobs, if you look at the representation, you find that Blacks are only represented at 31% of the population, compared to Asian and white individuals. And this is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Similarly, you can look at the amount of income one brings in, and you can see that there's a large discrepancy there as well. And so these are just things to keep in mind, to bear in mind, as we continue this conversation. Now, racism isn't just an out there problem. Some of you likely follow different tweets or Instagram feeds like Not So Ivory Tower, but higher education definitely is coming into its own and learning how to reconcile with its own racist past, and it's racism that's built into these institutions, into these structures. And so I just did a quick search, and when it's finally popping up in science, that the academic community has taken note of racism in higher education. And what I want to point out is that we may think, okay, it has to, there's nowhere really that's safe, and that's true. Even at SNC, we have a much growth to do. In fact, the latest rankings of U.S. News and World Report just came out, and if you're able to attend Corey's talk this morning, he made a note that we're at the bottom of the rankings when it comes to diversity. And so we have a lot of work to do. There was a specific number, but it's in my notes, and Google Slides doesn't do that. So one of the things that it comes up when these conversations start to happen in communities where there's a lot of learners, right? And many of us, that's why we're drawn to these kinds of institutions, is troubled knowledge that once we have it, um, makes us uncomfortable because of the implications of it or because of what we have to think about or feel. And it's uncomfortable for different people for different reasons. And so, and many times, like something like racism brings up a lot of troubled knowledge. And things to point out, racism divides a community. So in that way, racism is anti-communio. And so I would say it's anti-SNC. And so we need to think about how do we, knowing that this is a problem everywhere, that not just at St. Norbert College, how do we as our unique little community, how do we do better? And so I thought about, well, how did I learn to do better when it came in my own family? Knowing that I experienced privileges that my sisters didn't, when, what was useful. And so there's different zones. And in fact, there's been so much great work coming out lately. This is based off of research by Ibrahim Zandi, and his work is at the back as well. But another individual from Surgery Redesign put this together in an infographic. But the idea is that as an institution or as a group or as an individual is becoming anti-racist, you move through different zones or different stages. And so often we start off in this zone of fear whenever we are coming across something new. It's often a great survival mechanism to be afraid, to have that sense of suspicion for something. And so that's where I had pulled those questions that I had just asked you. So the range in our room was about 1.5 to 3. So at least 3 phrases were identified by more than 2 of you. And what this means is that in our community, we likely struggle with getting out of that fear zone and moving into what would be called in this model the learning zone, which is where we can start to have those uncomfortable conversations. And so to point out, it's things like recognizing racism is a present and current problem, so not something that existed in the past when Martin Luther King Jr. was marching, but now as well. Seeking out questions that make you uncomfortable, even, and not from people, the internet exists. There's a whole website, there's a whole link called Let Me Google That For You. So we can use that as well. But importantly, understanding your own privilege and how it's possible for you to ignore racism. And that's something that, like me, you likely benefit from being white. And that is something that makes it easier to act like this isn't something we have to handle, but it is. It impacts all of us. So how do we start to think about our vulnerabilities and how can we grow? And that's where we get into this growth zone, which is, something that we're striving toward. And something I also want to point out is that in any really complex developmental system, and when you're dealing with humans, it's always complex. Things are not always linear. Sometimes we go back and forth in our development and in our growth. And so that's possible here. So I thought about, one of the words that's been coming up a lot for me in my mind is bridges. How do we bridge these differences? How do we bridge these communities? And please note that bridge is only one possible metaphor, but if we can provide a bridge connecting East and West of Pier, then we can do that, I think, for our campus as well. So how do we move from the fear zone to learning and growth zones? And I think that is in part developing not only our knowledge, but our empathy. And so to develop our empathy, I think that there's a few strategies I would like to encourage us to consider. There's some research done on strategic empathy. I cited that paper, and you can find the link in the back as well, where you can use empathy in critical and strategic ways. So if you're a faculty member, for example, and you're trying to teach a difficult topic, then what you can often do is kind of see a student's emotions as a force that is not something, you don't necessarily need to manipulate that force so much as acknowledge that as part of the learning process. So when we're learning hard things, we feel a lot of emotions. And sometimes, our brains have difficulty being in control of those emotions when we're learning difficult things. It's a whole process that I could talk a whole lecture on in and of itself. But strategic empathy is this idea that you undermine these emotions and you start to get at what's causing them. What is the troubled knowledge? And how can you start to think about ways to get at the source of what's causing those problems, those emotions. So not just saying, oh, wow, now you know how it feels to read about this horrific experience that this woman went through, or as we've seen it take place on the national stage. Now it's moving from that, using that emotion, that empathy, in a way that allows us to take action, valuable action. So I thought about a few different books that could be helpful in this time, and this is by no means meant to be in any way exhaustive at all. It's just things that I've read that I've enjoyed. So reading and empathy, that's going to be, I'm going to go over 3 books, but research on reading and empathy is actually quite promising. And in fact, one of the ways that we seem to be able to learn about other people's perspectives is through reading novels. And so I'm talking specifically about a story. We respond emotionally to stories in a way we don't to facts. And that is why I think that it's important to not only read about the fact side, but also to think about it from the emotional side, from the spiritual side, and stories allow that to happen. And what I really appreciate about stories as well is that it allows us to have an emotional understanding of a traumatic event without asking the individual to retell the story themselves. So instead, by supporting some of these individuals, you actually are supporting them as living people. So Angie Thomas is a living, breathing person. Not all of the women I'll be talking about today are anymore, but each of these individuals has put life into this movement. And so I just want to share a little bit. So the first woman I wanted to talk about, and specifically the book I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, is by Maya Angelou. Dr. Maya Angelou was an amazing author, and this book made an impact on my life. I remember reading it. I believe it was in the 5th grade when I first came across it, and then I read it again in like the 9th grade. So high school, adolescent angst, all the fun. And I remember how refreshing it was to read a story that at least in some parts mirrored experiences that I'd had, and then of course helped me to understand other things that I hadn't experienced that Maya would talk about in her stories, that Dr. Angelou would talk about. But it not only provided me with life and energy, but it also provided me with empathy and perspective going forward. And so this book it's actually autobiographical, and it's her story of her girlhood, really. If you haven't read it, I would encourage you to, but I'm going to guess that many of you have. In fact, I'd like just to check and look at the chat box if you just want to make a note. If you've read this book, you can type yes, maybe you can, yeah. And so if you have not read this book, I think it's a great, all of them. She actually writes many, and it's a great map for actually development in general as we get older and the different challenges. So I recommend I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings. And then if you really find that you enjoy her writing style, she's written so much. She's written so many poems and so many books that I think. And this is her website, so I would recommend you going there, mayaangelou.com, and just kind of clicking around. But her life is just inspiring in so many ways. Okay, so Maya is one that I wanted to highlight. Dr. Angelou is one, and then another is Angie Thomas. Have any of you heard of this, The Hate You Give? Yes. Book or movie? Because I would argue there's a difference. Hopefully book. Okay. If you have not read this or watched it, it's also available on Audible. So I listened to it because I have a toddler, but something I really recommend listening or reading it. And it's refreshing because it's coming from the perspective of, oh, no, not yet. I need to put the chat box away. Go away, chat box. Okay. It's coming from the perspective of our youth in terms of the beginning of the story. There's a traumatic incident that happens with this young girl, but part of the point is that you just get a sense of what her life is like. And she's trying to come to terms with understanding why her white peers are racist towards her, and understanding how to navigate the dating world, right, as a woman of color, and how it's a different set of rules for her. And knowing that that's likely, in fact, it is something that our own students experience, I would really encourage you to check it out. And If you don't like reading, I'm sorry that I made it seem like books and that is it. The movie's still a very useful tool. In fact, there's a lot of great shows, but that's a different presentation. And this is Angie Thomas's website. She's done a lot of really cool stuff as well. She's a current author. If you want to support her work, I would recommend going and checking her out. And then this one is one that I just finished. It's called An Unkindness of Ghosts by River Solomon. And I just need to read the description River Solomon provides of themselves. River Solomon is a dyke, an anarchist, a she-beast, an exile, a shiv, a wreck, and a refugee of the transatlantic slave trade. Faye writes about life in the margins, where Faye's much at home. And this book is a sci-fi book. So the other one is more, contemporary, popular. This one is a sci-fi where, taking these really challenging topics and mirroring them in a future world, and how you see that certain things are still there. There's still a fight over resources. There's still this, but then there's these other elements that make it this new and creative space. And a lot of this book is spending time dealing with what we inherit from our mothers, and how we learn to use that information and the codes that we get from that to navigate. So it's very interesting in a lot of ways, but I would recommend this book as well. It's available on Audible, but it's also available on Amazon and other places. Has anyone read this one? Mindy, I can't speak to the movie, but okay. So Elizabeth, I'm guessing you're referring to not having read An Unkindness of Ghosts. Yeah, you definitely have to be into sci-fi, but I just thought it was great to have different options, right? Because there's all sorts. So I recommend, and there's many more, but I wanted to spend some time too as a group hearing and talking to each other. Oh, cool. Thanks, dear. So Steve said the Washington Post has a video interview later with Angie Thomas. So that would also be a great way to support representation of Black artists and authors, is to attend that. Okay, so now we are at the point where I am done talking, and I want to have us kind of engage in learning together, possibly. We'll see how it goes. So there's 3 questions that are up for discussion, I would say. And so I'd like you as a group to determine which of these questions that you would like to talk about. So when you get into your breakout rooms, I'd like you to start by introducing yourselves. If there are no extroverts in the room, then go by birth date. Youngest goes last. Then select a question, discuss the question, and choose someone from the group who'd be willing to summarize it for the larger group. And then depending on time, we may or may not be able to engage in that. But that is my goal. So you're going to have about 3 to 4 minutes to talk with each other. If we end up needing more time, we can do that. But you may be okay with just those 3 to 4. Okay, so Annika's going to go ahead and put you all into breakout rooms. So 2 of the things, and it's really hard, so I didn't know how deep to go or not go, so I erred on this side, and then that way if you're interested, I'll follow up. But when we're social creatures and we depend on each other, right? So we need to have essentially 2 skills. We like perspective taking and empathy are 2 of the pieces that allow us to engage with others socially. And empathy, the reason that's often emphasized is because it's the emotional piece, right? It's that feeling piece that we have. And so often academics try to separate the 2. There's the feeling and then the thinking. But work like this, the idea of strategic empathy is another way of saying your thinking can be put to good use beyond just allowing the feeling to be in your body and pass. So the strategic part is, it's not just thinking about another person's perspective. That would be perspective taking. It's the empathic part where you're understanding it at a deeper emotional and spiritual level. We still haven't come up with we don't have a consensus on what empathy means, but we do know that when it comes to thinking about helping other people, that it's not enough to feel the feelings. So it's not enough to empathize with another. that doesn't remove suffering, that doesn't change anybody's future suffering. Um, and so some in the field who've been doing, this work in their classrooms, they've discovered that the students will get really like emotional. And a lot of times faculty would just be like, but instead what they're, this conversation is, let's use this strategically for our learning. So strategic empathy is taking these feelings that we're having, knowing what those feelings are for our students or for others, and then channeling them into actions that can benefit the people we're feeling for. I hope that answered the question.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ken. All right, what else did you all talk about?
Our group talked about bias, and we're back to some of your first questions and talking about what who you feel more comfortable with necessarily and why. Like, how are you judging them? Are you judging them by the way they look or present? And how that can be a bias, or anticipating how others might be judging you by the way you look and how you present.
Yeah, that one, there's so much there. And it reminds me of Beverly, I always mess up her last name, Tatum O'Neill or Tatum, but where are all the Black kids sitting together in the cafeteria? But it's this idea that we tend to be more comfortable with people that we don't have to second guess, I think, so I think there's this idea that it's exhausting work to have to constantly think about how other people are seeing you and like flipping that lens back and forth. And so we tend not to want to. I mean, path of least resistance works for electronics, and we're mainly electrical, so. All right, so far we've talked about 2 of those questions. This is great. What other groups would like to share?
The group that I was in talked about which zone we're in, and then which zone we saw SNC in. So a lot of us fell kind of within the learning zone, where we've sort of broken out of that first fear zone, but where it's a little harder to make that jump into the growth zone.
Yes. Yeah.
And then for SNC, we kind of felt that SNC was hovering between the fear and the learning zone. It seems like there's been a lot of action and discussion led by staff and faculty, but there's not as much movement on the student side. So I think that's something that would be really great to see.
Yes, I agree. And I do know there's been, so sometimes it takes a while for us to communicate to each other. I think of us as like neural networks and different nodes of activation, but I do know some students have been working together on a scholarship and for our Indigenous students from the area, and that's going through with and I think they're here, so if they want to talk, they're welcome to. But there's a lot of really cool work going on behind the scenes, and the thing I really hope we can do is how do we bring that so that people who are interested can get engaged and get involved. Yeah, so I think that feels right, the idea that we're in this kind of place of fear, but also moving more towards learning. I think this is something where some individuals in this conversation have been having this conversation for a long time, and some are new. And so how do we figure out where to meet and where to build that bridge? That's kind of the idea. Let's see, does anyone else want to add in from the conversations that you had in your breakout rooms?
I can add what we talked about in our group. So we talked about the zones as well, and I kind of shared my take on it. And for like one of the first things that you had on the screen is like, I strive to be comfortable. And that's something that applied to me because I feel like at SNC, I'm like constantly uncomfortable because I'm always the only like person of color in the classroom, speaking about issues that we're discussing, and the only person that has experience. So a lot of times I am uncomfortable and I strive to be more comfortable. And you mentioned the land acknowledgement statement scholarship, and that's kind of an attempt for me to like have more Native students around, because that's kind of my comfort circle. That's where I feel most comfortable with people like me. So that's kind of where I stand on the topic.
Thank you for sharing, Ruthie. You're so brave. I Yep. I just think I wish I could like capture that feeling of like noticing that there's something going on that needs to be changed, and then jumping in and just doing that work, you know. That's so meaningful. And so something I'd encourage us to think about is how can we in this room think about our own skills. And so one of the Venn diagrams that I popped up was I'm going to see if I can do a screen share for a moment because I want to share that Venn diagram again. Because also Venn diagrams are the best, but nope, not there. Go back. Sorry, bear with me. There, okay, so I thought I put 2 slides of it and I did not. I'm going to cover mine. So can you just see the Venn diagram? Can we see that? I think so. Okay, good. Thank you for the thumbs up. But this diagram reminded me of what we've done with vocation here at SNC, with like the EMEA Center and the different work that's been done, where we think about what it means to have a calling and what it means to have something to offer. But it's this idea of, so I originally had thought about it with regards to calling, like vocation, but then you think about it with allyship as well. But what is it that you bring? What is your strength? What are your gifts? Like Chief Bola Delano put it really well when she talked to, like Dr. Delano talked about, some of you might have big talents and some of you might have, like, you know, the ability in your day-to-day interactions to make changes. And we all are doing it at different levels, you know, but thinking about what can you do that is combining your abilities with this knowledge that it needs to be more than empathy or knowledge, it needs to be action. So so that's really what a part of why I was so excited to see so many of you in this conversation today, because I know that some of our students like Ruthie are doing that work. And so I want to encourage you to think about how can you support these kinds of efforts? Like what can you do to help? And we each can do something a little bit different. Like I can make PowerPoint slides, you know, I have a lot of practice, and Google Slides. For example, I'm going to stop sharing again so I can look at your faces. But so what I would like to do for just a few minutes here is to use our chat box in a fun and innovative way. But I just want you to think about your circles at SNC, because it's also, you know, one of the magical things about days like today is this is probably the times where I see the most staff, or days like today where actually, you know, so who do you interact with at St. Norbert College? Do you interact mainly with students? Do you mainly interact with other staff? And I'd love to just kind of see that in the chat box, because I know that we have different views of the elephant, right? So how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. We have lots of bites to take. We all are seeing different parts of that elephant. I'm talking about an ear, you're talking about a flank. So where are you at the college? And that's, you know, something we can think about in terms of then how can we bring our college into being anti-racist? It starts with us. Where do we do our work? So I'm just looking at the chat box, hoping we type stuff. I see one new message, alumni and donors. Yes. Staff, yep. Mainly staff, quarantine, yep. So, you know, I'd like to take a moment and stop right here, and I'll tell you about the time I came the principal. What I want to hear from the students first. What song was I trying to sing? And then second question for you is, what are some things that you are good at, that you do for fun? How can you turn that into something meaningful for our campus? And if any of you are from my class, you know, shout out. Okay, students, let's move on then to staff, and I'll give the students some time to think. But as staff members, what work are you doing, or what work have you been doing to help make our campus anti-racist? So Bree, you've got a lot of contact then with people if you're a tour guide. Yeah, so I bet there's some useful, maybe thinking about, you know, are there ways in the tour that you can make sure that it, you know, there's lots of ideas there, but that's a very huge point of impact. So
yeah, it is. And the only thing in the script where we even mention the multicultural aspects of our campus is when we walk through the campus center and we point to the upstairs office and we say, that's the multicultural office. And then we continue. And I just feel like there could be so much more that's incorporated.
Yes, there could be, you know, like, and so that would be something I don't think would change too much, but just the script, just updating the script a little, right? Like, think about how many tours are given. Awesome stuff. Any other students? Because we've, you know, I've heard from a few of you already, but also staff. So staff, you know, I see a lot of wonderful faces. Yes, welcoming our new staff, right? And giving them a place of inclusion. Yes. Training, setting expectations, EDI initiatives with recruitment and onboarding of staff. Yeah, so these are all steps that you're taking now, right? Hiring diverse staff. Yes, and that one is so valuable. And I know that, you know, it sometimes takes more work to change where we post our ads or how we go about, you know, with our recruitment questions. That's something I'm on a search right now for my discipline. And it's a lot. So it's a lot of important work. Yep. All right. And I see some faculty in the room too. I know that there's a syllabus workshop that, you know, I'm definitely attending. I need to update some of my syllabi. But I know that there's other things that faculty can do in staff and admin. I saw admin as well. So faculty and admin. Storytelling, yes. Which stories do we choose to highlight? Which stories do we amplify? Where's that spotlight going? And how can we be more intentional about that? Who telling it is right? It's amazing how far a letter and encouraging note can go. And I actually do encourage you to think about your Black and brown friends right now in the United States in particular. There's like a certain amount of, there's a lot of fear out there. I have a neighbor down my street who refuses to pull down his Trump flag. And at this point, that is problematic and not okay. And if that's happening right here in good old Alloway, then it makes me think about, you know, those in our community, how are they feeling right now? So checking in on your friends and your colleagues, making sure that they know that they're welcome. We want everyone here. Curriculum, yes, changing pictures, voices, books, trying to find some kids' books. Angie Thomas, actually, one of her projects, so the Hate You Give is one of her books, but one of her projects was rewriting Dr. Seuss books because some of his, you know, there's a legacy of racism in some of his books as well. And so going through and trying to update that by creating, right? The opposite of war isn't peace, it's creation. What musical is that from, anyone? Correct. Okay, nicely done. Nicely done. It's amazing the things that you learn in college, you know? I watched a movie in my dorm room and like that word, like that part of the song really stuck in my head. I'm like, okay, it's not enough just to be peaceful. You have to be creating. In other words, it's not enough to not be racist. You have to be anti-racist, right? That's kind of how I've translated it in my mind. And who said it has to be boring, right? Well, I think that summarizes. I talked about all I wanted to. I do want to leave space though. If anyone has any thoughts that they want to share with the group, this is a great, any thoughts about what I talked to you about, I'd be happy to answer. But otherwise, um, that's what I had planned for the day.
Okay, I have a question, and then
Yes.
with your insight on something. So we're talking about, what you can read and things, and I was reading some Roald Dahl books to sorry about the kids.
To those kids in the background.
And there's a lot of passages in Roald Dahl books that are kind of problematic in today's world. So how do we approach those topics with our kids?
Okay, this is actually really great that you're asking this, because I'm struggling with this right now with Isabel. Okay, so she's into this book that's really creepy, and you probably all know it. The mommy holds the baby and she says, I love you forever. I like you for always. As long as I'm living, you're my baby, you'll be. Now, when my 3-year-old daughter is holding her baby doll and she's singing that, that's really cute, right? But then the story goes, it's a grown woman, crawls into her son's room while he's asleep at night, crawls into his bed, picks him up and carries him. And then the grown man then has a daughter that, and it's this idea that ideas, when you really bring them out and you have kids asking questions about them, you suddenly realize, I got to update this, right? So one strategy that this artist did, it's pretty new. I'll try to find the link, but he actually rewrote sections. So it's okay, up until page 13 of this book, it's awesome. But here I rewrote this part. And if you want it, here it is, it's free. You can just put it into the book and just replace that problem with this theme instead. So he's done it with a few books. He's done it with I love you love you forever, love you for always. He's done it with the, which is the one with the fish, with the fin, the sparkly fin, and everyone wants the sparkly fin, and now the fish has to downplay its magic for all of the other, do you know what I'm saying? That could be one of the messages. That's another of the books. What's the
Rainbow Fish.
Rainbow Fish. Benji, thank you. Okay, yes. So that was too, right? So what are these messages, and and there's actually social media stuff making it easier. So there are websites that have been starting to just here, print this page and put it in your book instead. That's one idea. That's not the only by all means, but Avery.
As a book enthusiast, can I add to that note too?
Please, yes.
Because I would also say counteract it with some other really amazing stories that are out there right now. And I think our group had talked about that as well. I had mentioned the authors Jacqueline Woodson and Jason Reynolds, both of them who do both novels, but also picture books. Jacqueline Woodson's has her Each Kindness, The Day You Begin. So many picture books are phenomenal, but I just finished her novel, Harbor Me, another really, really impactful story. Jason Reynolds, he actually partnered with Ibram Kendi to do a young adult version.
Okay, thank you for, yes. There's a series, that the diagram is actually based off of his work. So to read kids' books.
Yeah, he's phenomenal. I mean, there's just so many. The picture book, Parker Looks Up, was mentioned in Father Seamus's Constellation of Art today. I mean, so there's so many good picture books. I Am Enough, Hair Love. There's just so many. There's authors right now that are just, especially right now, being highlighted, voices being raised, because there's just so much good literature coming out for the young adult and young adult picture books, any of it. So, partnering and pairing up some of those not as great texts that maybe we're comfortable with, that we're familiar with. We read them, we loved them as a child, addressing the elephant in the room, talking about those parts that aren't as great, and then partnering them with some really, really great other literature, I think is a great way to handle that too.
So I agree. One of the things I struggle with though, and maybe you can address this, they're so expensive. So, and I don't have I love supporting artists, but I know not everyone can so how do we address that?
I have a ton of books. If anyone wants recommendations that are the same cost as any other book, because I am fine with my daughter reading the stuff I love to read too. I loved Boxcar Children. I loved
Babysitter Club.
She reads that one. Magic Treehouse and all that kind of stuff. But I also have been pulling a bunch of different new series, and there is a lot out there, but a lot of them are reasonably priced. Sorry, Chelsea, to jump in.
No, that's
That's fine. And I mean, as a teacher of pre-service teachers, I constantly am saying use your halfpricebooks.com, use your garage sales. I know that the Brown County Library has their Friends of the Library book sales that you can get some really good like books really cheap. Now, you aren't always finding your most current text. So in that case, I'd turn you to the library in general. Epic in terms of their app, their Libby app. I mean, you can rent them, check them out online. But they always have some really current titles. And even just to find those titles, Jillian Heisey is a local book a day author. She just puts out book lists. So you can constantly be finding some good book lists to pull from, and then just watch for them. And then just, again, check them out at your library. Go to your local schools and check them out from their libraries.
Can you do that if you're not at that school?
No. You can, yeah. I mean, you can talk to it depends on the schools. I know schools that if you have some kind of connection with them, usually are really apt to be able to pass on some titles. And so, but yeah, Brown County Library for sure constantly has the most updated titles.
And of course, we don't have to tell everybody that not every book out there is always a good book. Okay, so as we review books, and this is from the perspective of the teacher educator, we have to review books to make sure that they are culturally engaging and appropriate. You want to look at how BIPOC folks have been depicted. Are they depicted in active roles? That's important. When you pick up books about women, how are women depicted? Are they in active or passive roles? You have to look at that. You want to look at the back of the book. Look at the author. Who's the author? How can you find content that lets you know that they're actually experts about what they're talking about? You also want to review that. So there are quite a number of criteria out there that also guides us in helping you to make the decision that books are appropriate to read.
Thank you. And illustrations. Don't.
I have a question for our educators in the room. How would you go about having conversations with schools? So I found that my daughter's school sent a book home that I found really offensive and inappropriate. And I tried to broach the conversation and I never heard a word back.
Did you start with the teacher first, out of curiosity?
Yeah, I just spoke with the teacher.
Okay, and if it's not working with the teacher, then the principal, if it doesn't work for the principal, then you go right on to the superintendent. And there are quite a number of organizations around here that in our communities that continue to advocate that teachers use books that are appropriate, and the library too, you know. And I understand that there's quite some thought about, do you pull books or do you not pull books? But it's important that the books that we use in our classrooms are appropriate, culturally appropriate to use, and relevant and responsive. So I will encourage you, Avery, if you have not had any responses and you've gone through all those levels, then you go directly to the superintendent. And if that doesn't work, then it's all about activism.
These are really great links. So I'm gonna hopefully, thank you, Ruthie. That's
okay. I'll be saving the books that have been put into the chat, and I have a list of emails of everybody who's registered, and I'd be happy to email out these books.
Very great. Yeah, it was very, very, like, there are so many books, and so I was like, there's no one wants just to be talked at all day. So I was like, I'll just choose the ones that have been in my head over and over on repeat lately. I agree, Jennifer. Annika is the best. You know, she just had a birthday recently.
If I may interject one more time, there's actually another website out there. It's called American Indians in Children's Lit. Dr. Debbie Reese has been reviewing books for years, but she's made it available. It's a website that is free to everyone out there. Even when I doubted a book, I emailed her and she responded immediately. So she's been doing research about this for ages regarding books that depict Indigenous folks. So again, it's called American Indians and Children Lit. Look it up, it's easy. And you're going to find quite a number of books out there. And she basically reviews all those books to let you know if they're appropriate or not to use in the classroom.
I think that brings a really good point up, Bola. Thank you for sharing that about part of like, we're in a new place in history, I think, in terms of we don't have to keep redoing each other's efforts, like that brain work that goes into creating that list. Like this work is being, you know, people are already doing this great work. Let's support them, bring, you know, attention to that work that's being done. And that way we don't spend all of our time doing that instead of what's unique to our community that we need to be focusing on too. Like I know we have a kids book at our bookstore, don't we? Norby Night or something. Yeah, so thinking about ideas. Okay, check out Zoe and Sasa. All right, and I believe today was 2:30 to 3:30.
Yeah, it looks like we're about at time today. So if everybody could join me in thanking Dr. Lopez for sharing her insights with us today, and helping us explore strategic empathy and other things that will help us move in the direction of becoming more actively anti-racist.